Hello everyone, I'm David Vaucher. Welcome to Return on Racing. Return on Racing is powered by Vaucher Analytics, which helps race teams and drivers drive efficiencies off track so they can fuel success on track. Return on Racing is also brought to you by the Motorsport Sponsorship Accelerator, the most cutting edge resource out there to learn how to find, maintain, and grow long-term sponsorship relationships. If you're interested in finding out more, please visit the Vaucher Analytics website at www.vaucheranalytics.com and use the navigation links in the top right hand of your screen. Now, today's episode of Return on Racing is the second part of a two-part series examining whether or not Porsche could actually leave the WEC. In the first part, which I'll link to in the show notes, I talked about how this isn't necessarily about money, and that's important because usually when a team, factory, or otherwise leaves racing, it is about money. In that first part, though, I alluded to several different layers of action that go on in racing, and I ended that episode saying that this affected two specific areas. And these were both mentioned by Thomas Laudenbach, the VP of Porsche Motorsports, whose quotes really were the genesis for all of this line of thinking in this two-part episode. And those two things that were listed were the balance of performance, or the BOP, and the long-term convergence, or lack thereof, between LMH and LMDh prototype sports cars. If you're at all involved in online discussions or debates or arguments about motorsports, you know that certainly the first one, the BOP, comes up a lot. So this may or may not be controversial depending on your point of view. I will say, if you have any thoughts, please do send them to me at contact@vaucheranalytics.com. I would love to hear them. And with that, let's just get right into it with my thoughts on the BOP, which is that it's a pillar of the platinum age of sports car racing. BOP is controversial, but it is foundational. I've written before that keeping manufacturers engaged is the first rule of modern motorsport. It is absolutely crucial and paramount. And you keep manufacturers happy and engaged by preventing two things. First, one or two teams being so dominant that it causes others to question their efforts. And second, a cost spiral where everyone feels like they have to spend more and more just to stay afloat, let alone win. In endurance racing, we have an example not so far away. This was what happened with the LMP1 category, but you can look across all of racing and find ample examples of where a cost spiral leads to the demise of a racing series. Now, if you can prevent these two things, more teams will come, and more teams means stronger grids, more competitive racing, and faster fan growth. Fans sometimes say, and again, this is where the online discussions come in, well, you should just let the chips fall where they may and let the best team win. But that is strategically naive. If one manufacturer dominates year after year, the rest of the field starts to question their spend, new entrants hesitate, and casual fans will check out. To stop this, you need mechanisms to keep the playing field tight. F1, of course, uses a cost cap. Spec-leaning series like IndyCar with spec chassis, constrained aero, and different engine OEMs inherently limit the gravest performance differences, although admittedly, they don't necessarily limit disparities in spending. But the spirit of IndyCar is very much to have common characteristics. Now, the WEC and IMSA rely on BOP, adjusting weight and power to keep grids competitive. Here is the crux of the matter. Does BOP decide everything? No, of course not. BOP touches only the car's baseline. Strategy, driver skill, pit stops, and execution remain decisive. A team could have the most favorable BOP and still lose with poor decisions. And I want you to just think about this hypothetical exercise. Let's say that you put me together and as many other fans as required to put together a proper, or at least a fully staffed racing team. You could give us the car, the equipment, and everything, and give us an absolute rocking BOP decision. And I still think we'd come dead last by a long shot because it's not just the BOP in the car, it's everything else. It's the expertise of the crew, it's the coherence behind them, it's everything. So yes, Porsche was stung at Le Mans 2025. More on that in a moment because there's some subtlety there. And the year in WC is rough after they took the Drivers' Championship last year, so it is a little bit of a fall from grace. But it's hard to see how that would be enough to make Porsche walk away. And here's why I think that BOP alone isn't a justification, as Thomas Laudenbach seems to be alluding to in his comments. Porsche have been racing for decades. They know success comes down to execution as much as machinery, And Penske's motto, Roger Penske's motto of Penske Perfect, reflects exactly that. It means perfection across the organization. Here's the subtlety I mentioned just a moment ago. The Le Mans BOP is separate from the WEC BOP. Porsche, of course, knows this. If Le Mans is the ultimate goal, and make no mistake, for Roger Penske it is, because it's the one trophy missing from his incredibly impressive list of achievements, one frustrating year shouldn't justify abandoning the whole program. Also, Porsche are hardly the first manufacturer to be vocal about this. Toyota have been just as vocal about BOP frustrations this season, with equally disappointing results. Yet, as far as I know, they aren't threatening to quit. If anything, Toyota seems to understand that leaving during what I've called the platinum age, and not just me, everyone else that's interested in the sport of racing, would only hand more spotlight to rivals. Which raises the bigger question. If BOP alone doesn't explain Porsche's posture, then what does? Unlike BOP, there is historical precedent for legitimate concern over the ongoing separation of the LMH and LMDh rule sets. I want to take a little bit of a step back in time, because the more I learn about motorsport history, and this is something I love learning about, the more I realize that, as in so many other areas of life, what's past is prologue in motorsports. So, whereas the BOP debate collapses under serious scrutiny, the issue of technical convergence is far more significant, and it sits at the heart of one of motorsport's most damaging historical episodes. Among hardcore IndyCar fans, the split is still the shorthand explanation for why the series today underperforms relative to its potential. The full history is complex, but one thing is clear. US open wheel racing would look very different today if its stakeholders had managed to agree on technical coherence. In the 1970s, IndyCar was sanctioned by the United States Auto Club, or USAC. At the same time, another open wheel series, Formula 5000, was running, and there were discussions about a merger. A unified set of rules could have created a single, compelling championship with the best drivers, cars, and teams in North America. Instead, the merger never happened. Worse, in 1979, the leading teams splintered off to form championship auto racing teams, or CART. Technical disagreements between USAC and CART followed, and teams were forced to constantly adjust, never certain that their configuration would be competitive or even allowed from one event to the next. Now, the issues continued long into the future. In fact, the split refers to something else entirely, but this is the beginning of where some of that dysfunction came to be, and it rests on technical specifications. And from the perspective of teams and drivers, this uncertainty was intolerable. Why invest millions in engines or chassis when you couldn't be sure the rules wouldn't tilt against you the next season? And the long-term effect was corrosive. Fragmentation, fan confusion, and a loss of credibility that American open wheel racing, you could argue, has never actually fully recovered from. Which brings us back to Porsche. Their demand for coherence between LMH and LMDh rule sets is perfectly understandable. In IMSA, their performance has outshone their WEC results, and clearly the uncertainty around how the two technical formulas are balanced leaves them uneasy. The logic is straightforward. Align the rules, ensure parity, and wherever you race, you know you're on even footing. More consistency should, in theory, mean more certainty, and crucially, happier manufacturers. But as USAC and CART proved, convergence is very difficult. First, you need consensus that convergence is necessary. That's not a given. Then you have to define what coherent actually means. It's much harder. And finally, you have to absorb the enormous switching costs of aligning programs built on different foundations. The race reports that LMH and LMDh convergence may not arrive until the next decade. And Porsche know this, which is why the idea they would walk away now is contradictory. Leaving the WEC would mean forfeiting any influence in shaping the rule set they claim is so central to their future. Is it really logical to believe that they would leave, then return under a rule set in which they had little to no involvement? So when Loudenbach floats the possibility of an exit, it isn't really about money. It isn't even about BOP or technical minutiae, at least not directly. It's about the layers of motorsport that you don't see play out on track, but are arguably the most important because they literally determine how that racing looks in the first place. I've alluded to these so far in part 1 and part 2, and I want to delve into them in full right now. So these two remaining layers above and beyond the on-track action are the endless jockeying over how rules are interpreted and the political maneuvering that decides who gets to write them in the first place. So to be clear, there are three levels of motorsport. First, there's the sport you see on track: cars, drivers, lap times. Then there's the sport behind the sport, exploiting loopholes, interpreting gray areas, or better yet, shaping the rulebook to your advantage. And racing is full of these examples. F1 has some of the most famous, I guess you could say, glaring if you want to be a bit more cynical. But this is a full-time activity behind the racing in the world of motorsport. And then there's the third part, which are the politics that underpin both. This is the ongoing maneuvering, lobbying, and influence games that determine whose vision of the rules prevail. When Thomas Laudenbach speaks about Porsche potentially leaving the WEC, he's not really talking about level 1, even if that would be understandable. Porsche won the WEC driver's title in 2024, and 2025 has been largely unremarkable. His frustration, as I see it, is with levels 2 and 3, the rules game and the politics underpinning it. As soon as regulations are announced, engineers and team principals will pour over them trying to find any way to bend the spirit of these regulations to their will, while staying within the letter of those rules. For instance, the recent McLaren FlexiWing controversy certainly caused a lot of discussion between team principals and the FIA. Going back even further, Colin Chapman's dual chassis Lotus 88 went ahead in development because the regulations did not specify whether the word chassis was singular or plural, but was quickly disallowed after it was unveiled because teams, fearing they would be at a huge technical disadvantage, protested to the FIA and won. And if you want to know more about that, run a quick search for the Lotus 88. It really is quite ingenious and a very clever way of thinking and interpreting the rules. So that last part, though, about how all the teams banded together and got the Lotus 88 banned is crucial, because how rules are followed ultimately comes down to value judgments made by people. So their relationships with those jockeying for any advantage may, however subtly, affect those calls. So you can be sure that politics play an enormous part of motorsport, and this, as I see it, is the game that Porsche are playing. To make sense of this, you really have to think about Porsche's outsized role, of course, in motorsport, but in the WEC specifically. If Porsche left the WEC, it would certainly be a shock, but it wouldn't be the first to leave. It wouldn't even be the first globally known Volkswagen AG-owned brand to leave. Indeed, Lamborghini recently exited the WEC after the two-car manufacturer rule went into effect. Now, to be fair, endurance prototypes were always an ambitious stretch for a brand whose racing pedigree was still under construction. Their withdrawal wasn't all that shocking, disappointing, certainly, but not shocking. Rather, it reflected the realities of cost, BOP, and the marketing calculus changing once results failed to keep pace with expectations. So in this particular instance, the manufacturer was left unhappy, did not see the return as being worth the investment, and adjusted accordingly. But Lamborghini aren't the only ones. Isata Fraschini, Manuel, and Glickenhaus all left competition as well. Perhaps to recoup some of the costs of hypercar development, Glickenhaus developed a road-going version of its 007, but this isn't really the same as what Ferrari and McLaren have been doing, because could it ever hope to produce enough on a scale to self-fund a two-car WEC program? But Porsche are different. It has decades of heritage and the scale to outmuscle obstacles that could and have derailed smaller competitors. What Porsche are seemingly trying to do by floating an exit is to leverage their influence and bank on the assumption that the WEC will not want to let them go, perhaps fearing that fans will see the competition as somehow diminished without the Stuttgart Titan, or that other manufacturers will also run for the exit if they see an established brand like Porsche leaving. If public reactions from some of their peers are any indication, this is a topic of active discussion behind the scenes. In a recently published piece in Sports Car 365, both Thomas Laudenbach, with Porsche running a 963 LMDh, to be clear, and Toyota Gazoo Racing's technical director David Fleury, representing, again for clarification, the GR010 LMH, were asked about their points of view on matters of leveling the playing field. They were not in agreement. The former wants some kind of development limitations without a BOP, while the latter doesn't agree with the premise that addressing convergence would inherently solve the WEC's competitive balancing. What this all comes down to at least as I'm interpreting it, is that by speaking publicly through key team members such as Thomas Laudenbach, Porsche have the opportunity to test their views and assumptions with the public. If those views resonate well, they have leverage with which to go back to the sanctioning bodies to swing regulations closer to their liking. And this is, of course, against their backdrop of their immense influence and history in motorsports generally. Unfortunately for Porsche, if Toyota's comments are any indication, Porsche are losing ground in the politics of who defines the rules. Toyota are openly questioning Porsche's framing, and Ferrari, the other main player on the WEC grid, is unlikely to say much in a season when they have been so dominant. So will anyone actually follow Porsche out the door? Well, my opinion, my hypothesis, is that at the moment, this seems unlikely. Ultimately, manufacturers care about engagement, and WEC races have been breaking attendance records in 2025. Even Peugeot, whose parent company Stellantis has arguably been having an even harder time than Volkswagen AG, and who have also been very vocal about their treatment under the WEC's BOP, have not only committed to staying on the grid, but have also hinted at the possibility of a new hypercar to follow the 9X8. In light of all of this, can Porsche really hope to unilaterally force a move away from the BOP, or is the WEC facing a future without one of the most storied names in racing? To put the question in a blunt, different phrasing, is the 963 program done for? Well, history shows that in motorsport, nobody wins when the tent is split. CART needed the prestige of USAC's Indy 500, and USAC needed CART's star power, and both lost when they failed to reconcile with, again, issues persisting far into the future from that particular dispute. The same dynamic exists today. Porsche and the WEC need each other, and let's not forget Roger Penske, for whom an overall Le Mans victory remains the final jewel missing from a legendary career, would agree with that. Make no mistake, Porsche, at least in my view, is not going anywhere, and that's Porsche racing. So we will continue to see Porsches on track. There's no reason the 963 can't remain an option for competitive teams in the ALMS, assuming Porsche is okay with losing some of its control over the narrative and performance arc of its flagship sports car. That is not necessarily the topic of discussion for today, but it's an important point to consider. And of course, Porsche's GT3 ecosystem, which is one of the most extensive in the world and one of the world's most popular racing classes, is surely far too lucrative and too embedded to disappear. So what's at stake here is not Porsche's racing presence, but rather, of course, its factory flagship program. Nevertheless, here's what I'd say, and I always say this. Cutting is easy. Converting the halo into cash, well, that is where leadership and real business acumen come through. Porsche are one of the world's most storied companies, and it's hard to see a scenario where they would indiscriminately put any of their racing, reputation, and activities at risk. For the on-track concerns, fans who still rage about the balance of performance should remember that stability is precisely what attracted brands such as Ford, Genesis, and McLaren on top of the incredible grid the WEC already has in 2025. Current hypercar rules are homologated until 2032, and if the long-term goal is to eliminate BOP, the pathway will be slow and political. In the meantime, as long as grandstands stay full and the grids keep swelling, what incentive is there really for the collective for there to be change overnight? Which is why, to me, Porsche's public comments look less like a genuine withdrawal threat and more like a bargaining position. You float the extreme option, you walk away, and then you negotiate down to something that you can live with. And that begs the question, for Porsche, what might that something actually look like? A very brief overview of that would be something like, first, regulatory concessions. So you might get BOP reform, such as greater transparency and independent auditing, which would reduce the perception. I want to be clear, this is the perception of Ferrari favoritism, not reality, perception. And then perhaps convergence milestones. So even if full LMDh unification waits until the next decade, perhaps Porsche could push for some interim compromises, and I'll leave to your imagination what those might be. Second area of potential concessions might be commercial leverage. So perhaps there's a stronger commitment that Porsche's branding will be seen even more intensively at WEC events. And again, I'll let you imagine what that could look like actually on track. Another area of incentives or rather concessions might be financial offsets. So perhaps things like, reduced entry fees, freight subsidies, or other cost breaks. Again, entirely hypothetical. I'm just saying this for illustration. Or there could be some various sponsorship guarantees or sponsorship opportunities. Again, purely hypothetical. I don't want to delve too much into this. I think the most important one, and this is what we've been covering, is that the concessions might be in terms of political influence. And you may never actually see this, of course, in the news, but you could probably see its effects. And this would be things like more voice in FIA or ACO technical working groups, or an early role in shaping the post-2032 rule set to ensure alignment with Porsche's investment. And this goes back to that entire political game that I've based my hypothesis on. So, seen in that light, Porsche's exit talk isn't really about abandoning the WEC. It's about reminding everyone, rivals, regulators, and even its own board that holds the purse strings that endurance racing's platinum age cannot shine with Stuttgart at its center. Whether or not Porsche gets everything that they want, the message is clear. This is less about money than it is about flexing raw power. And that's it for me. I really hope you enjoyed this two-part series. And as always, I want to thank you for choosing to spend your time with me here on Return on Racing. If you enjoyed this, I'd like to encourage you and request that you please consider to sign up for the Return on Racing newsletter. These are insights delivered in less than 500 words to you on a weekly basis directly to your inbox. So the idea is to present clear, actionable insights that you can apply immediately to your motorsport operations. If this sounds appealing, please visit the WEC Analytics website at www.wecanalytics.com. You can sign up right from the front page, and I'll also leave a link in the show notes. Before I leave you, again, I want to take a moment to thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with me here on Return on Racing, and I really look forward to speaking with you on the next episode.